She thought she was just doing her job. A flight attendant, tired, overworked, following the rules. Until one day, she slapped a passenger, a black man in a tailored suit, because he refused to move seats. What she didn't know was that he wasn't just any passenger. He was the CEO and the owner of the airline she worked for. Imagine that moment, the silence in the cabin, the shock in her chest when she realized what she had done. Would you try to explain yourself? Would you walk away? Or would you stay and face the storm that was about to destroy everything you'd built? This isn't a story about punishment. It's about choices, about pride and humility, about what happens when life forces you to look in the mirror and the person staring back isn't who you thought you were. If it were you, what would you do? Would you fight for your redemption? Would you forgive yourself if the world never did? This is a story about falling and rising again, about grace, forgiveness, and the power of second chances. Stay with me, because what happens next will change how you see people forever. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so more people can join us in stories that make us feel, think, and heal together. The morning light spilled through the high glass walls of JFK Airport, scattering across polished granite like liquid silver. Announcements echoed above the crowd, final calls, gate changes, and the restless rhythm of rolling suitcases. It was 7:05 m. Eastern. Inside gate C-18, the first-class line shimmered with pressed suits, designer luggage, and the faint scent of espresso. At the end of that line stood Evelyn Harris. She wasn't tall, yet she carried herself with a quiet gravity that made space bend politely around her. A navy blue wool suit wrapped her frame, pearl earrings catching the sun. Her right hand rested on a cane carved from dark ebony wood, smooth, polished, slightly worn at the curve where her thumb had known it for years. Each tap of that cane against the floor sounded steady, deliberate, like the second hand of an expensive watch. Evelyn adjusted the cuff of her blazer and checked the boarding pass printed in gold letters, Global Air, First Class, Seat 1A. She had taken hundreds of flights in her life, but rarely as a passenger these days. Still, there was comfort in routine airports were temples of order, and she had built an empire on order. A voice sliced through the hum. "Ma'am, this line is for first-class passengers only." Julia Monroe, 32, stood at the podium, hair pinned into a perfect bun that didn't dare move. Her uniform was crisp, her smile professional, her tone carrying that subtle sharpness of someone who had been up since 3 and was tired of being questioned. Evelyn looked up, calm. "I am a first-class passenger," she said, offering her ticket. Julia's eyes flicked over the paper, then back at Evelyn's face, lingering half a second too long. Something tightened in her jaw. The line behind murmured impatiently. Julia pressed the mic button on her headset. "We'll have to verify this, ma'am." "Of course," Evelyn replied. But Julia didn't take the ticket. She gestured vaguely toward the economy queue. "Please wait over there while I check. We'll call you if it's valid." The man behind Evelyn shifted uncomfortably. Evelyn smiled at him, the kind of gentle smile that says, "I'm used to this." She didn't move. Julia noticed. Her own cheeks flushed. "Ma'am, you're holding up boarding. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," Evelyn said softly. The crowd quieted. The sound of the cane against the floor returned 1, 2, 3 soft taps as Evelyn leaned slightly forward, extending the boarding pass once more. Julia exhaled sharply and snatched it from her hand. Her manicured nail scraped the paper. "Seat 1A. Huh, she muttered. Interesting. She turned to the screen, typing with clipped keystrokes. Evelyn watched the reflection of sunlight tremble on the glass wall. She had seen this scene before, different faces, same tone. Julia looked up. I'm not seeing your name on our upgrade list. Are you sure this isn't business class? It's not an upgrade, Evelyn said. It's a purchase. Julia's brows knit tighter. May I see your ID? Evelyn reached for her leather wallet. Her fingers moved slowly, not from age, but from intention. Julia glanced at the cane, the gray hair coiled neatly behind Evelyn's head, the dark skin glowing warm under the morning light. A flicker of judgment, unspoken but visible, crossed her eyes. When Evelyn handed the ID over, Julia sighed as if doing her a favor. Thank you, she said flatly, glancing at the photo, then back. Same woman, same calm. But Julia's voice stayed firm. This looks fine, but the ticket code's unusual. Let me call my supervisor. Evelyn nodded. Take your time. A family in line whispered. A man checked his watch. The hum of disapproval grew, faint but contagious. Someone behind said quietly, She paid for her seat. Let her through. Julia ignored it. Then, the phone at the podium rang. Julia picked it up, listening briefly, then frowned. Hold on, she said into the receiver. She says she's first class, but the system wait, yes. I'll handle it. She hung up and turned toward Evelyn. Ma'am, I'm sorry, but this ticket doesn't look standard. You might have to rebook at the service counter. Evelyn's brows lifted slightly. Are you certain? Julia crossed her arms. Ma'am, please don't make this difficult. The tone hit like a slap. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the cane. Her voice stayed even. Young lady, I've flown with Global Air since before you were born. I assure you, my ticket is valid. Julia reached forward. Let me see that again. When Evelyn hesitated, Julia's patience snapped. She snatched the paper back, brushing against Evelyn's hand. The cane tipped, clattering to the floor. For a split second, the terminal froze. The sound echoed like thunder in the glass chamber. Evelyn steadied herself on the rail. Julia bent instinctively, grabbed the ticket, then without thinking, waved it accusingly. You can't just print fake first-class passes. Ma'am, you people always try to. She stopped mid-sentence, realizing too late what had escaped her mouth. The silence afterward was electric. Every head turned. A security officer near the gate stiffened. Evelyn's expression didn't change. She bent, picked up her cane, and looked Julia in the eye. You've just made the biggest mistake of your career. Her voice was low, not angry, worse. It was certain. That certainty made Julia's stomach twist. Before Julia could respond, a tall man in a navy blazer approached from the service corridor. Is there a problem here? He asked. Julia straightened, forcing a smile. All under control. Sir, I'm handling a potential ticket issue. The man turned toward Evelyn and froze. Color drained from his face. Ms. Harris, I didn't realize you were traveling today. Evelyn inclined her head slightly. Good morning, Richard. Julia blinked. Wait, you know her? Richard exhaled slowly. Yes, Julia. Everyone at Global Air knows her. The murmur in the terminal thickened. Julia looked from him to Evelyn, confused. Her pulse drummed in her ears. Richard's voice dropped to a whisper. She's not just a passenger. She's Evelyn raised a hand, stopping him. Not now, she said. Let's board the others first. Her calm sliced deeper than any anger could. She retrieved her ticket from Julia's trembling fingers, straightened the edge gently, and walked toward the jet bridge. the steady rhythm of her cane marking every step. Behind her, the line of passengers parted in silence. The air inside the terminal grew heavier after Evelyn walked away. For a few seconds, no one said anything. Then the whispers started, thin at first, then thicker, rolling like smoke through the crowd. Did she really just talk to that lady like that? Someone muttered. Another voice, sharper, added, "That was out of line." Julia Monroe's cheeks burned. Her throat tightened. She stared at the ticket still in her hand, creased where her fingers had gripped it too hard. Her heart hammered. She looked at the manager, Richard Cole, who was still standing a few steps away, watching Evelyn's slow, dignified walk down the jet bridge. Richard turned toward Julia. "We'll talk about this later," he said quietly. Then he followed Evelyn onto the plane. Julia tried to shake it off. She adjusted her scarf, forcing her breathing to slow. Passengers began boarding again, but every pair of eyes seemed to glance at her, some pitying, some judging. The family with 2 kids avoided eye contact. A businessman gave her a long, disappointed look before stepping through the gate. Julia's hands trembled. She told herself she was only enforcing rules. She'd done nothing wrong. Still, something inside her chest felt heavy, like a knot tightening. When the final call echoed through the terminal, Julia finally exhaled and reached for her water bottle. Her palms were damp. The taste of guilt sat bitter in her mouth, though she didn't want to name it. Inside the plane, first-class passengers were settling into their wide leather seats. Champagne glasses clinked softly. The hum of the engines had not yet started, and everything still felt oddly quiet, too quiet. Evelyn Harris sat in seat 1O, her cane resting neatly by her leg. She gazed out the window at the tarmac, where the sunlight caught streaks of frost along the edge of the glass. Her reflection in the window looked calm, but her pulse tapped lightly at her wrist. She had learned long ago to control her face, to let silence do the speaking. Richard approached her gently. "Ms. Harris, I'm truly sorry for what happened." Evelyn turned to him, voice even. "Richard, we'll handle it later. Right now, I'd prefer to fly in peace." He nodded, throat tight. "Understood, ma'am." As he stepped away, Evelyn sighed. She wasn't angry, not yet. She had seen too many versions of this moment across her lifetime. People doubting her right to be somewhere, assuming her presence was a mistake. Each time it cut the same way, but the years had taught her that anger, when used wisely, could build bridges stronger than any policy ever could. Meanwhile, back at the gate, Julia finished the boarding checks. Her chest ached with an unfamiliar sense of dread. When the doors closed, she straightened her jacket, preparing to join the crew, but a voice from behind startled her. "Ms. Monroe." It was the gate supervisor. "Yes," she said, forcing a smile. "The operations office would like to see you before takeoff." Her stomach dropped. Is something wrong? The supervisor's look said everything. "You should go." Julia followed him through the narrow service corridor that led to the side office near the jet bridge. Inside, the air was cooler, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. A phone rang once, then stopped. Richard was waiting for her, standing by the desk. He didn't look angry, just tired. "Sit down, Julia." She obeyed. Her knees brushed the chair legs. Richard took a slow breath. "Do you understand who that passenger was?" Julia blinked. "You said her name was Harris. I don't know. Maybe she works for corporate." Richard rubbed his forehead. "She doesn't work for corporate. She owns corporate." Julia stared at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, she's the founder and CEO of Global Air, the airline you work for. The woman whose signature is on your paycheck." Julia's mind went blank. She heard the words but couldn't process them. That can't be right. That woman, she looked... "Careful," Richard said quietly. His tone carried warning, not threat. Julia swallowed the rest of her sentence. "I just mean she didn't seem like what? Like someone who belongs in first class." Richard asked. "Julia, I saw what happened at the gate. So did a dozen passengers with their phones out." Her face went pale. "They were filming." "Yes. And I'm sure at least one of those videos will reach the internet by lunchtime." Julia pressed her hands together. "Oh my God." Richard's voice softened. "Evelyn Harris built this company 40 years ago, started with 2 planes, fought her way through investors who wouldn't trust a black woman with $1 of funding. You've probably read her story in the company training packet. Page 4. Julia remembered the page vaguely. The smiling portrait of a younger Evelyn, shaking hands with the mayor at an opening ceremony. She had skimmed over it, never imagining the woman in the photo would one day stand in her line, quiet and unassuming. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I believe you," Richard said. "But that's the point. You didn't see her. You saw an idea in your head and reacted." He let the words hang in the air. The hum of the fluorescent lights filled the silence. Julia looked down at her uniform badge, the tiny Global Air wings gleaming against navy fabric. They felt heavier than they ever had before. "What's going to happen to me?" she asked. "That depends on her," Richard replied. "For now. I've told the captain you're not joining the crew for this flight. We'll need to review the incident once we land in Dallas." Julia nodded slowly. Her throat felt dry. "I didn't mean to hurt her," she said quietly. "I just thought she was cutting the line. I was trying to do my job." Richard's eyes softened. Sometimes doing the job isn't the same as doing what's right. He stood, gathering his papers. "Take the next flight out, Julia, and think about how you want to handle the apology, because you will be seeing her again." When he left, Julia sat alone in the humming room. Her reflection stared back from the dark window, a uniformed woman who had followed every rule and still managed to break the one that mattered most. Out on the tarmac, Flight 247 rolled toward the runway. Inside, Evelyn closed her eyes as the plane began to taxi. The vibration of the engines hummed through the seat. She rested her hand on her cane, feeling the carved ridges beneath her fingers. Her late husband had carved it from African ebony, a reminder, he'd said, that strength could be both beautiful and unyielding. As the plane lifted into the gray morning sky, she felt the weight of what had happened settle into her chest, not as anger, but as responsibility. There was a conversation that needed to happen, not to humiliate, not to punish, but to teach, 30,000 feet below. Julia walked through the nearly empty terminal toward the staff exit. Her reflection trailed beside her on the glass walls, small, shaky, distorted by sunlight. She replayed every word, every gesture, every flicker of irritation that had flashed across her face at the gate. She remembered the moment Evelyn had said, "You've just made the biggest mistake of your career." At the time, she had dismissed it as arrogance. Now it echoed like a prophecy. She stopped by a window overlooking the runway. The plane was already climbing, a silver streak disappearing into cloud. Julia whispered under her breath, "What have I done?" The airport continued its rhythm boarding calls, rolling luggage. the smell of coffee from a nearby kiosk. Life moved on. But Julia stayed there for another minute, watching the plane fade into the distance, wishing she could rewind the morning and start again. The truth, though, was already taking flight. By noon, the video had reached the internet. It started as a short clip 27 seconds long, posted by a teenager who had been waiting near gate C-18. The title was simple: Flight Attendant Freaks Out on Elderly Passenger. Within hours, it spread across social media. By the time Julia Monroe landed in Dallas on the later flight, her name was trending. Someone had tagged Global Air, and the comments had turned into wildfire. "This is disgusting. Fire her immediately. That woman handled herself like royalty. Anyone know who the older lady is? She looks familiar." Julia stared at her phone in disbelief as the numbers climbed. She scrolled through hundreds of notifications, each one heavier than the last. Her photo, taken from her company profile, was now everywhere. Her inbox overflowed with angry messages. Her throat went dry. She set the phone down and buried her face in her hands. A knock sounded on the hotel room door. Julia. It was Richard Cole. She hesitated, then opened the door. Richard's expression was grave, but not cruel. "We have to go," he said. "Ms. Harris requested a meeting. Right now." Her stomach clenched. "She wants to see me." "Yes," he said quietly. "And Julia, this is serious. You need to be honest." The drive to Global Air's Dallas headquarters felt endless. Outside, the afternoon heat shimmered across the asphalt, the kind that made the world look like it was melting. Julia watched the skyline rise in the distance, the glass towers reflecting white sun like knives. Inside the car, silence pressed heavy between them. Julia broke it first. "Does she hate me?" Richard shook his head. "Evelyn Harris doesn't hate easily, but she doesn't forget either." The words hung in the air like a warning. When they arrived, the building looked massive, its chrome letters spelling Global Air across the glass facade. Julia followed Richard inside, heart pounding. Every step felt like walking deeper into a courtroom. At the end of a long corridor, a secretary led them into a private conference room. The room was quiet, lined with framed photographs, decades of milestones, new aircrafts, charity events. Evelyn standing beside presidents and governors. Her presence was everywhere. Evelyn Harris sat at the head of the table, perfectly still, a folder in front of her. Her navy suit matched the deep mahogany of the table. The cane rested beside her chair, a silent witness. Julia's throat went dry. She stood near the doorway, her hands clasped tightly together. Evelyn didn't look up right away. When she did, her eyes were calm but piercing. "Ms. Monroe," she said. "Please, sit." Julia obeyed. The chair felt too big, the air too thin. Evelyn opened the folder, glanced at the printed screenshots. "I assume you've seen what's online." Julia nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, ma'am. Do you recognize yourself?" Julia's eyes filled. "I do." Evelyn studied her for a moment, then closed the folder. "I've watched that clip more times than I wanted to," she said softly. "Not because I enjoy reliving it, but because I needed to understand what you were thinking in that moment." Julia's voice cracked. "I wasn't thinking. I just saw a passenger who didn't fit what I expected for first class. I reacted. I did what you were trained to do." Evelyn interrupted. Julia hesitated. "To enforce policy, yes, but I crossed a line." Evelyn leaned back slightly. "You enforced the letter of policy, not the spirit. You saw a ticket, you saw a face, and you made a decision based on which one you trusted less." Tears welled in Julia's eyes. "I'm so sorry, Ms. Harris. I can't undo it. But please believe me, I didn't know who you were." "That's exactly the problem," Evelyn said quietly. "You didn't need to know who I was to treat me with respect." The words hit Julia like cold water. She looked down, ashamed. Evelyn rose from her chair. Even standing with the cane, she carried more authority than anyone Julia had ever met. "When I was your age," Evelyn said, "I was told I couldn't sit in a first-class cabin. I built this airline to prove that dignity has no dress code, no color, and no price tag." She walked slowly to the window, the Dallas skyline glowing behind her. Yet here we are, decades later, and I'm still having the same conversation. Julia's voice trembled. "If you want to fire me, I understand." Evelyn turned back toward her. "Fire you?" She shook her head. "That would be too easy." Julia blinked in confusion. "People learn nothing from losing a job," Evelyn continued, "but they can learn everything from facing themselves." She walked closer, tapping the cane lightly against the floor. "I'm not going to fire you. Instead, you'll work under a special assignment reporting directly to me. You'll serve on my flight tomorrow to Houston." Julia's heart skipped. "Serve you, yes. You'll attend to me personally, every request, every detail. You'll see what true service looks like, not the kind written in manuals, but the kind that starts in the heart." Julia's mouth opened, then closed again. She nodded slowly. "I'll do it." Evelyn studied her face. "Are you agreeing out of guilt or growth?" Julia paused. "Maybe both, but I'll try to make it the second. For the first time?" Evelyn smiled barely. "But it was there. Then we'll see what kind of person you can become." She turned to Richard. "Arrange her assignment. Tomorrow morning. Flight 328 to Houston. First-class cabin. I'll be in 1A. Richard nodded, still silent. Evelyn looked back at Julia. "One more thing," she said. "Leave your pride at the gate." "It's heavier than any luggage," Julia whispered. "Yes, ma'am." When she left the room, the hall outside felt brighter, almost blinding. Her reflection in the glass looked smaller, humbled. She walked toward the elevator, the echo of Evelyn's cane still in her ears. Inside the elevator, she caught her own eyes in the mirrored panel. They looked tired, but different. The arrogance she'd carried all morning had drained away, replaced by something raw and unfamiliar awareness. She whispered to herself, "Tomorrow, I'll do better." Back in the conference room, Evelyn stood alone by the window. Richard approached her carefully. "Was that the right call?" he asked. Evelyn didn't answer right away. She stared at the city skyline, where the sun dipped low, turning the glass towers gold. "When I started this company," she said, "I was told no one would fly with a black woman's airline. I didn't fight them with anger. I fought them with excellence. If I can't teach that to the people who wear my wings, then all of this means nothing." Richard nodded. "She seems willing to learn." Evelyn smiled faintly. "So was I. Once, outside, traffic hummed along the Dallas freeways. Inside, Evelyn felt the ache of old wounds she thought had long healed. But beneath that ache was something stronger, a hope that maybe, just maybe, redemption could travel both ways. Morning light spilled across the runways of Dallas-Fort Worth, a pale gold haze shimmering above the tarmac. The engines of Flight 328 hummed low and steady, ready for boarding. Inside the first-class cabin, Evelyn Harris sat quietly in seat 1A, the same seat from yesterday's incident. Her cane leaned against the armrest, polished and still. The cabin smelled faintly of leather and coffee. Flight attendants moved quickly, checking compartments, arranging napkins, pretending not to look at her. They had all seen the video. Everyone had. Evelyn opened the small book resting on her lap, an old leather-bound journal with edges softened by time. Inside were pages of handwritten notes, speeches, reflections, and quotes she collected through the years. Her late husband's favorite line was written on the first page: "Leadership isn't about being obeyed. It's about being remembered for how you made people feel." She traced the words with her finger, then closed the book. Outside the cabin door, Julia Monroe stood frozen for several seconds. She had put on her uniform twice that morning, once at home, then again after changing her mind. Her reflection in the mirror didn't look like the same woman who had shouted at a passenger 2 days ago. Her hair was tied tighter, her eyes quieter. She carried no makeup except a thin line of eyeliner, as if to remind herself to see clearly this time. "Ms. Monroe," the chief steward called softly. "Passengers will board soon." Julia nodded. "Yes, I'm ready." She wasn't. The first few passengers filed in, glancing at her. Some recognized her immediately from the viral clip. A man whispered something under his breath. A woman in sunglasses shook her head. Julia kept smiling mechanically, politely, painfully. Her hands moved through the motions she'd practiced for years: offer, assist, repeat, but her stomach stayed tight. When Evelyn's eyes met hers across the aisle, Julia felt her chest tighten. The older woman looked calm, unreadable. She offered no smile, no anger, just quiet observation. After all passengers boarded, the doors closed. The captain's voice came through the speaker. "Good morning, folks. This is Captain Reynolds. Welcome aboard Global Air Flight 328 service to Houston. We'll be departing shortly. Sit back, relax, and enjoy your flight." Julia began her safety checks. She moved through the cabin, her voice steady, her gestures precise. When she finished, she walked back to Evelyn's row and stopped. "Would you like some water, Ms. Harris?" she asked softly. Evelyn looked up. "Yes, thank you." Julia poured it carefully, both hands steady this time. When she placed the glass down, Evelyn said quietly, "You don't have to be afraid of looking at me." Julia's breath caught. "I'm not afraid," she said. "I'm ashamed." Evelyn studied her face. "Good. Shame means you still have a conscience. But don't stay there too long. It becomes another kind of pride." Julia frowned slightly. "Pride." "Yes," Evelyn said. "Self-pity is pride in disguise. It keeps you centered on yourself. Growth requires looking outward." The plane began to move. The low rumble filled the cabin, shaking the glass slightly. Julia braced herself as the engines roared, the sound of acceleration vibrating through her bones. She felt small and weightless. As they climbed through the clouds, the seatbelt sign flicked off. Julia started her routine service. Every time she passed Evelyn's seat, she felt a pulse of tension, like gravity shifting around her. Halfway through the flight, Evelyn pressed the call button. Julia approached quickly. "Yes, ma'am." Evelyn gestured toward the empty seat beside her. "Sit." Julia hesitated. "I'm on duty. I'm aware," Evelyn replied, her eyes steady. "Consider this part of it." Julia sat down carefully. The hum of the engine softened around them. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Evelyn said, "Tell me something. Ms. Monroe, why did you become a flight attendant?" Julia thought for a moment. "When I was a kid, my mom cleaned hotel rooms. Sometimes she'd bring me with her after school. I'd watch guests come and go, and I thought maybe one day I'll be the one traveling, not cleaning. So I studied, worked hard, and I got here. Evelyn nodded slowly. And along the way, what did you learn about service? Julia looked down at her hands. That it's not easy. People can be rude, entitled. Sometimes you stop seeing them as people. They just become noise you manage. Evelyn's voice softened. And sometimes that's how people see you too. Julia's throat tightened. Yes, they do. Then the question becomes, Evelyn said, do you rise above that, or do you repeat it? Julia swallowed hard. I repeated it. Evelyn leaned back, her gaze gentle but firm. Then learned something from it. Don't defend yourself by saying you were doing your job. Policies don't excuse prejudice. Julia nodded, tears forming. I know. I didn't think. I reacted. Reaction without reflection, Evelyn said, is how most harm happens in this world. For a long moment, the two women sat in silence, the sound of the engines filling the space between them. Evelyn looked out the window, where the clouds stretched endlessly, glowing white against a cobalt sky. I was younger than you when I started this airline, Evelyn said quietly. Every contract, every meeting, someone would talk to me like I didn't belong. Some days I wanted to scream, but I realized if I wanted the world to change, I had to start with how I carried myself. Julia listened, her chest tightening. How did you do it? How did you keep believing people could change? Evelyn smiled faintly. Because I did. I wasn't always this calm woman you see now. I had anger too, but anger is like jet fuel. It can lift you or burn you. You decide which. Julia wiped a tear. I think I've been burning. Then maybe it's time to fly, Evelyn said. The announcement came over the speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be descending into Houston shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts. Julia stood to secure the cabin. She felt lighter, though her heart was still sore. When she returned to Evelyn's row, the older woman was watching her quietly. You did well today, Evelyn said. Not because you served me perfectly, but because you listened. Julia smiled faintly. Thank you. As the plane landed, passengers applauded softly. The wheels touched down, a clean glide across the runway. When the door opened, sunlight poured in, bright, golden, forgiving. Evelyn stood slowly, gripping her cane. Julia offered her arm without thinking. Evelyn accepted it, and for the first time, their steps matched. At the jet bridge, Evelyn turned to her. Tomorrow, there will be a board inquiry. Don't be afraid of it. Tell the truth. The truth doesn't need makeup. Julia nodded. I understand. Evelyn smiled, her voice soft but clear. You will. As Evelyn walked away, passengers parted quietly, giving her space not out of fear, but respect. Julia stood at the gate watching her disappear into the sunlight, the rhythm of the cane fading into the crowd. For the first time in days, Julia breathed deeply. The air felt lighter. Somewhere deep inside, the knot that had been strangling her chest began to loosen. The road to redemption had just begun. The next morning arrived gray and heavy over Dallas. A soft rain tapped against the wide windows of Global Air headquarters, blurring the city skyline into silver streaks. Inside the conference floor, people moved with quiet urgency. Every suit, every file, every whisper carried the same undertone. The meeting today was not routine. Julia Monroe sat alone outside the boardroom, staring at the pattern of the carpet. Her palms were cold. She had barely slept. haunted by flashes of that moment at JFK, the sound of the ticket tearing, the look on Evelyn's face, the weight of silence afterward. Her phone buzzed with another news alert. Global Air CEO confronts racist incident. Personally. She didn't open it. She couldn't. A door opened behind her. Richard Cole stepped out, holding a folder and a cup of coffee. "You ready?" he asked quietly. Julia looked up. "As ready as I'll ever be." He handed her the coffee. "Don't try to defend yourself. Just tell the truth. Evelyn values honesty more than excuses." She nodded. "I understand." He gave her a reassuring smile. "You'll be fine." When the boardroom doors opened, Julia stepped inside. The room was enormous tall glass windows, a polished mahogany table, 12 board members seated in a semicircle. At the center sat Evelyn Harris, calm as ever, her cane resting beside her chair. Every conversation stopped the moment Julia entered. The only sound left was the steady tick of the wall clock. Evelyn gestured to an empty seat. "Miss Monroe, please join us." Julia sat down. The leather chair felt too soft, too large. She folded her hands in her lap. Stephen Caldwell, Executive Vice President, adjusted his glasses. "We're here to review the incident that occurred at JFK International 2 days ago." He began. "Ms. Monroe, the company received over 3 million views on social media regarding the footage. Our reputation has taken a severe hit." Julia nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." He continued, "We've already suspended you pending review. But before we make any final decision, Ms. Harris has requested this meeting." Evelyn spoke next, her tone even. "I want to hear her version first." Julia's throat felt tight. She glanced briefly at Evelyn, who gave a small nod, as if to say, "Go on." "I made assumptions," Julia said quietly. "I saw Ms. Harris in line and thought her ticket was invalid. I didn't verify properly. I spoke rudely. I crossed the line, and I caused her public humiliation. There's no excuse for that." The room stayed silent. Even the hum of the air conditioner seemed to fade. Stephen leaned forward. "Did you realize the passenger you insulted was our founder and CEO?" "No," Julia whispered. "And that's the part that hurts the most. Because even if she weren't, what I did would still be wrong." For a moment, Evelyn's eyes softened. Another board member spoke. "We've had multiple complaints about bias in customer service across the industry. This incident made us a symbol of everything wrong with that culture. We can't afford leniency here." Murmurs of agreement followed. Evelyn tapped her cane lightly against the floor. The sound cut through the noise. "Let's not pretend firing one woman will fix systemic rot," she said quietly. Stephen frowned. "With all due respect, Ms. Harris, this isn't just about the system. It's about accountability." "Exactly," Evelyn replied, "and accountability is more than punishment." She turned toward Julia. "Ms. Monroe, tell me, what have you learned since that day?" Julia took a deep breath. "That kindness without awareness isn't enough, that I can follow every rule in the book and still fail at being human. I thought professionalism was about control, but I forgot empathy. I forgot that everyone walking into that line is carrying their own story." Her voice cracked slightly. "I can't erase what happened, but I want to do better. I need to." A few board members exchanged looks. Evelyn leaned forward, resting her hands on the table. "You said something important. You said I forgot empathy. Most people never even realize they did." She turned to the rest of the board. "We can terminate her and make a press statement, or we can do something harder, something that might actually mean something." Stephen adjusted his tie. "What do you propose?" Evelyn looked around the room, her tone measured but powerful. "We create an internal restorative program, not just for Julia, but for all of us. Diversity training isn't enough. We need a culture of awareness, of compassion. I want her to be the first to go through it, and when she finishes, she'll lead the program for future employees." A murmur rippled through the room. One board member objected. "With all due respect, Ms. Harris, public opinion is calling for termination. This decision might be seen as too lenient." Evelyn met his gaze. Public opinion changes every day. Integrity doesn't. The room fell silent again. Richard, who had been standing in the corner, finally spoke. "Ma'am, if I may, when I saw them at the gate, I was ashamed. Not because of Julia alone, but because I didn't step in sooner. What she did was wrong. But the truth is, we've all been silent witnesses to moments like that. Maybe this is our chance to fix more than one thing." Evelyn gave him a grateful nod. "Exactly." Stephen exhaled, leaning back. "So you're recommending a 6-month corrective training program?" "Yes," Evelyn said, "with mentorship, education, and direct service. She'll work with diverse communities, hear stories from people she might never have spoken to otherwise. Let her see the world she serves." Julia blinked, overwhelmed. "You'd really let me do that?" Evelyn's expression softened. "Let you? I'm requiring it." A faint chuckle escaped around the table, breaking the tension. Stephen finally nodded. "All right, Miss Harris, the board will defer to your judgment." Evelyn tapped her cane again. "Decisive this time." Then it's settled. The meeting adjourned. Board members filed out quietly, murmuring to one another. When the room emptied, only Evelyn, Julia, and Richard remained. Julia turned to Evelyn, her voice trembling. "I don't deserve your mercy." Evelyn looked at her kindly. "Mercy isn't about who deserves it. It's about who needs it most." Julia's eyes filled again. "I'll make this right." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Don't promise perfection. Promise effort. And remember, this company was built to lift people, not to look down on them." Richard handed Julia a folder. Inside was the outline of her 6-month program: community service, mentorship under Evelyn, workshops on unconscious bias, and fieldwork across several airports. Julia held the paper carefully, as if it were both punishment and gift. "Thank you," she said softly. As she left the room, the rain outside had stopped. Light filtered through the glass, pale but clean. She walked past the framed photo of Evelyn at the company's founding ceremony. The younger version of Evelyn stood smiling, eyes full of determination. Julia paused, looking at that photo, and whispered, "I'll earn this second chance." Inside the room, Evelyn remained seated for a while longer. She looked out the window at the wet streets below. Her reflection merged with the cityscape, gray clouds swirling behind her. She whispered to herself, almost a prayer, "Change doesn't start in policy. It starts in the mirror." And for the first time in days, she felt hope return, fragile but real. 3 weeks had passed since the inquiry. The media storm had begun to fade, replaced by new scandals, new distractions, but inside Julia Monroe, the noise hadn't stopped. Every morning she woke before dawn, restless, uncertain what each day would bring. Her uniform hung in the closet untouched. Her schedule, once packed with flight rotations, was replaced by something far less predictable. Evelyn Harris's 6-month re-education program. Her first assignment was handwritten on a single sheet of Global Air Stationary Report to Skybridge Community Center. Observe before you speak. E.H. So on a cool Saturday morning, Julia drove to a modest building in South Dallas, its walls painted with murals of airplanes, children, and bright skies. The sign read, Skybridge Aviation Mentorship for Underprivileged Youth. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and crayons. Dozens of kids in worn sneakers sat around tables building model planes from cardboard and glue. At the far end of the room, a man in his 60s was teaching about lift and thrust using a paper fan. When Julia entered, he turned and smiled. "You must be Miss Monroe," he said warmly. "Evelyn told me you'd be joining us." "Yes, sir," Julia said softly. "I'm David Lawson," he said, shaking her hand. "Retired pilot. Been working here since I hung up my wings. We teach these kids about aviation, give them a sky to dream about." Julia smiled politely. "I'm here to help however I can." He nodded toward the tables. "Good. Start by helping them build their wings." Julia hesitated. "Wings." He chuckled. "Paper wings, Miss Monroe. Not everything that flies needs fuel." The children giggled, handing her scissors and glue sticks. For the next hour, Julia worked alongside them, cutting, folding, gluing. The sound of laughter and paper rustling filled the air. Slowly, she began to relax. One little girl named Lena tugged at her sleeve. "Miss Julia, did you ever fly a plane?" Julia smiled. "No, sweetheart. I work inside them, helping passengers." Lena's eyes widened. Like a sky helper, Julia laughed softly. Exactly. The innocence in the girl's voice struck her heart. These children didn't know her story. They didn't see the viral clip or the comments calling her names. To them, she was just an adult in uniform, someone who worked among the clouds. Later that afternoon, Julia stepped outside to take a break. The sun had climbed high, the air warm but gentle. Evelyn's car pulled up quietly beside the curb. Julia froze. She hadn't expected her today. Evelyn stepped out slowly, her cane tapping the ground with steady rhythm. She wore a light gray suit and dark sunglasses. "Ms. Harris," Julia said quickly, standing straighter. "I didn't know you'd be here. I like to see things for myself." Evelyn replied. "How's the first day?" Julia hesitated. "Different, but good. These kids are amazing." Evelyn smiled faintly. "They are the reason I started this program. Aviation gave me freedom when the world told me I couldn't have any. I wanted them to know the sky belongs to them, too." Julia nodded. "I understand." Evelyn studied her. "Do you?" Julia took a breath. "Not fully, but I'm trying." They walked slowly toward the playground, the laughter of children echoing behind them. Evelyn leaned on her cane, her pace measured. "Tell me what you've learned so far," she said. Julia thought for a moment. That humility isn't a feeling, it's a muscle. You have to use it, or it goes weak. Evelyn gave a quiet laugh. "That's a good start." They stopped by a bench under the shade of a tree. The sound of wind rustling through the leaves filled the pause. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" Evelyn asked. Julia looked uncertain. "A failure." Evelyn shook her head. "No, a mirror. I see the version of myself that used to fight everyone, even the people trying to help. You're angry at the world, but most of all, at yourself." Julia looked down. "I've ruined everything." "No," Evelyn said gently. "You revealed everything. That's not the same." Julia blinked, trying to absorb it. "I don't think I'll ever be able to erase what happened." Evelyn sighed. "You can't, and you shouldn't. The point isn't to erase it, it's to outgrow it." For a while, neither of them spoke. A plane passed overhead, its distant roar fading into the clouds. Evelyn tilted her face upward, smiling faintly. "You hear that?" she said softly. "That's forgiveness. It moves fast and high. But if you look long enough, you can still see it." Julia followed her gaze, eyes glistening. Back inside, the children had gathered around a small stage. David Lawson was showing them how wind lifts a wing. Julia and Evelyn watched quietly as Lena held up her paper plane and threw it across the room. It sailed in a perfect arc, landing gently in Evelyn's lap. The girl gasped. It found the pilot. Evelyn chuckled and handed it back. "You're quite the engineer, young lady." The girl beamed. Later that evening, as the center emptied and the sun dipped low, Julia helped clean the tables. Her hands smelled of glue and crayons. Evelyn watched her work, then said, "Come to my office Monday morning. There's something I want to show you." Julia nodded. "Yes, ma'am." As Evelyn walked toward her car, she stopped and turned. "You did well today. Remember, redemption isn't a finish line. It's a daily flight plan." Julia smiled softly. "Thank you, Ms. Harris." When the car drove away, Julia stood alone in the parking lot. The sky had turned golden orange. She lifted her face to it, breathing in deeply. For the first time in weeks, the air didn't feel heavy. She whispered to herself, "I think I can still fly." That night, she wrote in her notebook, Day 21. I served kids instead of passengers today. They didn't tip, complain, or record me. They just smiled. Maybe service starts where judgment ends. She closed the notebook and placed it by her bedside. Her hands trembled slightly, but not from fear. It was something new, something close to hope. In another part of the city, Evelyn sat by her window with a cup of tea. The skyline glowed with scattered lights. She thought about Julia, about the countless people she'd met in her career who never got the chance to learn what this young woman was learning now. She whispered to herself, "Maybe this time the lesson will stick." A soft smile touched her lips. The rain had stopped completely. The clouds had cleared. And somewhere, far above the city, another Global Air flight crossed the night sky, glowing faintly against the stars, steady, bright, unbroken. Monday morning came quietly. The air over downtown Dallas shimmered with the first warmth of spring. Julia Monroe parked her car outside the Global Air Tower and sat there for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel. She could see her reflection in the windshield, tired but determined. Inside her bag was a notebook filled with Evelyn's quotes and her own notes from the Skybridge Center. Julia had spent the weekend replaying every moment of her first week there, the children's laughter, Evelyn's words, the paper wings. Something inside her was shifting slowly, painfully, but real. She took a deep breath and walked inside. The receptionist smiled faintly. "Ms. Harris is expecting you." Julia followed the familiar hallway to the top floor. The doors opened into a quiet, sunlit office overlooking the city. Evelyn Harris sat behind her desk, dressed in a cream suit. The cane leaned against her chair. On the wall behind her hung a black and white photograph, a young Evelyn, barely 30, standing in front of the first Global airplane. "Good morning, Ms. Monroe," Evelyn said, her tone calm but warm. "Good morning, ma'am," Julia replied softly. Evelyn gestured toward the chair across from her. "Sit. I want to show you something." Julia sat down, setting her notebook on her lap. Evelyn opened a drawer and pulled out an old file. Its edges yellowed with age. She slid it across the table. "Do you know what this is?" Julia looked at the faded label. It read, Incident Report 1981. I don't, she said. Evelyn smiled faintly. That's because this one never made the news. Back then, there were no phones filming every injustice. She opened the file, revealing a few typewritten pages. This was me, 44 years ago. I was a flight attendant, the only black woman on my crew. One morning, I was removed from a flight after a passenger complained about my accent. They said I didn't sound American enough. My supervisor told me to go home and wait until people were ready for my kind. Julia's eyes widened. They said that to you. Evelyn nodded. I was younger than you are now. I went home crying. I almost gave up. But then I decided to build an airline that would never treat anyone that way again. Her voice softened, filled with both memory and power. I started with 2 borrowed planes and a vision. People laughed at me. Banks turned me away. But I didn't stop. And now, here we are, the same sky, a different century, yet somehow the same lesson. Julia's throat tightened. You went through that, and you still chose kindness with me. Evelyn smiled. I chose understanding. Anger built my ambition, but forgiveness built my legacy. The words hung in the air like sunlight breaking through cloud. Julia whispered, I don't know if I could have done that. Evelyn looked at her gently. You will, one day, but not by pretending this never happened. You'll carry it, the way I carry this cane, not as a symbol of weakness, but of the road that shaped me. Julia looked at the cane, its wood dark and polished, carved with tiny African patterns. Who made it, my husband? Evelyn said softly. He carved it when we were young. Said it would remind me that no matter how far I flew, my roots would hold me steady. He passed before he saw this company take off. Julia swallowed hard. I'm sorry. Evelyn smiled faintly. Don't be. He'd have loved to see what this company became, though he'd probably laugh at how fancy the planes got. For a moment, both women laughed quietly, the tension easing between them. Then Evelyn leaned forward. Tell me something. Julia, why do you think I didn't fire you? Julia hesitated. Because you wanted to teach me partly, Evelyn said, but mostly because firing you would have made me no better than the people who once judged me. They used power to shame. I use it to lift. Julia nodded, eyes glistening. You lifted me when I didn't deserve it. Evelyn tilted her head. You didn't deserve punishment. You deserved perspective. There's a difference. The office fell quiet again. Outside, a plane roared faintly overhead, its shadow gliding across the city below. Evelyn looked out the window and said softly, You know what I've learned after all these years. The higher we fly, the smaller people look from above. But that doesn't mean they matter less. It just means we have to work harder to see them clearly. Julia let the words sink in. She thought of the passengers she'd dismissed, the faces she'd ignored, the invisible stories walking past her every day. I want to see them, she said quietly. All of them, the way you do. Evelyn smiled. Then start with yourself. You can't serve the world until you understand your own humanity. Julia nodded slowly. I'm trying. I know, Evelyn said. And that's why I'm giving you a second assignment. She reached into her drawer again and handed Julia another envelope. Inside was a printed itinerary labeled Flight Immersion Cross-Cultural Training. You'll travel for 6 weeks, Evelyn explained. Different cities, different crews. Not as a flight attendant, but as an observer. Watch how service works in different cultures, how people greet, how they listen, how they show respect. Bring me what you learn. Julia blinked. That's incredible. Evelyn's eyes softened. It will be difficult. You'll be anonymous. No one will know your story. You'll see what the world looks like when you're not in uniform and when you can't hide behind one. Julia smiled faintly. That sounds terrifying. Evelyn nodded. Good. Growth usually is. Julia stood, clutching the envelope. I won't let you down. Evelyn rose too, steadying herself with the cane. You already didn't, she said softly. You just needed to find your altitude. For a moment, their eyes met not as employer and employee, not even as teacher and student, but as two women connected by the shared turbulence of being misunderstood and still choosing grace. When Julia left the office, the city outside seemed sharper, brighter. She walked past the lobby wall where a quote from Evelyn was engraved in gold letters. We rise by lifting others. She stopped and read it again. This time, she understood. That night, Julia packed her suitcase. She placed her Global Air badge on top, next to her journal, in the mirror. She barely recognized herself, not because she looked different, but because her eyes did. They were steadier, humbler, alive. She whispered, Tomorrow, I start over. Across town. Evelyn sat in her living room, tea steaming beside her. On her lap rested the same journal she'd shown Julia, now open to a fresh page. She wrote slowly, March 14th. Sometimes, the best lessons come disguised as mistakes. The girl reminds me of myself fragile, stubborn, full of potential. Maybe the sky sent her to remind me that even in the clouds, there's still work to be done. She closed the journal, smiling softly. Outside her window, another plane ascended into the evening sky, its lights flickering against the pink horizon. She followed it until it disappeared into the clouds. And for the first time in years, Evelyn felt something she hadn't felt since her first flight all those decades ago. Faith that change was still possible, and that somewhere, above the noise of engines and the rush of time, people could still learn to see each other again. The first stop on Julia Monroe's itinerary was Chicago. A cold wind swept through the airport as she stepped out of the terminal, suitcase in hand. Her Global Air badge was tucked away in her coat pocket. Evelyn had told her to travel without it. No uniforms, Evelyn had said. You're not here to represent the airline. You're here to represent a student of life. Julia smiled faintly at the memory. It felt strange to move through airports anonymously, without passengers' eyes on her or colleagues calling her name. For the first time, she was just another traveler, invisible, ordinary, free. She spent her first 2 days shadowing local airport staff, learning from janitors, gate agents, baggage handlers, and even the barista who worked near Terminal 3. Each person she met had a story she'd never heard before, stories she'd never bothered to ask. On the third morning, she sat with a woman named Tanya, a cleaning supervisor who had worked the night shift for 15 years. Tanya laughed easily, her eyes tired but kind. You know, people barely look at us, Tanya said, wiping her hands on her apron. They walk past like we're part of the floor. But that's all right. The ones who see us really see us. They make the job worth it. Julia listened quietly. I used to be one of those people who didn't look. Tanya smiled. Then you've already learned your first lesson. That night, Julia wrote in her journal at a small hotel desk lesson 1. The world runs on invisible hands. Respect starts where recognition begins. From Chicago, she flew to New Orleans, then Atlanta, then Seattle. Each city added a new page to her journey. In Atlanta, She met Mr. Lewis, a retired ground crewman who had once worked for Global Air in its early years. When she mentioned Evelyn Harris, his eyes lit up. Ms. Harris. Oh, that woman changed everything, he said, voice thick with pride. When I started, black employees couldn't even greet passengers in first class. She changed that rule herself, said, if they can fly, they can serve. You tell her I still remember that. Julia smiled. I will. He nodded, wiping his brow. You're lucky to learn from her. Most folks only read about her. On the flight to Seattle, Julia sat by the window, staring out at the horizon. The sky was endless, layered with soft gold and silver streaks. For years, this view had been routine. Now it felt sacred. She thought about Evelyn, how she carried herself, how her voice could be both gentle and unshakable. She wondered how one woman could turn pain into wisdom so effortlessly. When the plane landed, she stayed seated for a long time, watching passengers rush off. The seatbelt light turned off, and she finally stood, whispering to herself, "Don't rush through the lessons." Seattle brought rain. It rained every morning, soft and steady, like the sky was cleansing everything below. Julia volunteered at a local food bank near the airport, where she helped serve meals to travelers stranded by canceled flights. She met people from every corner of the world, some laughing, some lost, all human. One afternoon, she helped a young man named Arjun, who had missed his flight and was nearly in tears. His wallet had been stolen, and he didn't know anyone in the city. Julia sat beside him, shared her sandwich, and helped him call the airline to rebook. When he finally smiled in relief, Julia realized something profound. Service wasn't just about policies or uniforms. It was about presence, about showing up when someone needed you, even for a few minutes. That night, her journal entry read, Lesson 2. You can't serve from the sky if you can't kneel to help someone on the ground. 2 weeks later, she flew to Los Angeles for the final leg of her journey. Evelyn had arranged a visit to a women's shelter that partnered with Global Air's outreach program. The shelter director, Maria Santos, greeted her warmly. "Ms. Harris said you'd come," she said. "We host women from all over different countries, different lives. You'll hear things you're not ready for. That's how you'll know you're learning." Julia spent the next few days listening to stories of survival and resilience. One woman had escaped domestic violence. Another had fled war. A third had lost everything in a house fire, but still smiled when she talked about her dreams of becoming a pilot. Julia felt her chest tighten with empathy and guilt. These women had lived through storms she could hardly imagine. And yet, their laughter was genuine, their hope unbroken. On her last day there, one of them, a woman named Nadia, hugged her tightly. "You work for the airline lady, right? The one who owns the planes?" Julia nodded. "Yes." "Evelyn Harris?" Nadia smiled. "Tell her thank you. She gave us tickets to see our families again. That was the first time I felt free in years." Julia's eyes filled. "I will tell her." When she boarded her flight back to Dallas, she felt different. Not lighter, not heavier, just clearer. The seatbelt clicked, and she stared out the window as the engines roared to life. Somewhere between the clouds, she closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Ms. Harris." Back in Dallas, Evelyn was waiting. Her office lights glowed against the evening skyline. She stood by the window when Julia walked in, her cane resting nearby. "You've been gone 6 weeks," Evelyn said. "Tell me what you found." Julia smiled softly. "People. Just people. Everywhere. some angry, some kind, all trying to be seen. Evelyn nodded. And what did you see in yourself? Julia hesitated. Someone who stopped hiding behind policies. Someone who listens before reacting. Evelyn smiled faintly. Then the program worked. Julia reached into her bag and handed her journal across the desk. These are my notes. Lessons from every city. Evelyn flipped through the pages, eyes scanning the handwritten words. You've learned faster than I expected. Julia shook her head. No, ma'am. I just learned how much I didn't know. They both laughed quietly. Evelyn closed the journal. Tomorrow, you'll return to work, but not as who you were. You'll train new attendants in empathy and service. You'll carry this forward. Julia's eyes widened. You want me to teach, yes, Evelyn said. Because the best teachers are those who once failed the test. Tears welled in Julia's eyes. I won't let you down. Evelyn smiled. You already lifted yourself up. They stood together by the window. Outside, the city lights flickered like 1,000 tiny runways. Evelyn placed a hand on Julia's shoulder. Remember, she said softly, redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about writing the next chapter better. Julia nodded. Then let's make it a good one. The two women stood silently for a moment, watching as a Global Air jet soared through the night sky. Its tail lights blinked steadily, cutting across the darkness a perfect symbol of how far they'd both come. Evelyn whispered, Look at that. Still flying. Julia smiled, tears glistening. Yes, ma'am. Still flying. 2 months later, Julia Monroe walked through the familiar glass doors of Global Air headquarters. The same security desk, the same scent of polished marble and jet fuel drifting faintly from the hangars outside. But this time, something inside her felt different. She wasn't walking in as a uniformed attendant. She wasn't walking in as a defendant at an inquiry. She was walking in as a woman who had been broken, rebuilt, and finally ready to serve something bigger than herself. On her wrist, she still wore the same silver bracelet her mother gave her years ago scratched. Simple, grounding. It reminded her where she came from. The training center was buzzing. New recruits filled the rows, young faces eager, some nervous, some already proud. Julia stood by the door for a moment, watching them laugh and take selfies in their crisp Navy uniforms. She remembered when she'd been one of them, years ago, dreaming of travel and freedom, but knowing nothing of humility. Ms. Monroe, a voice called. She turned to see Richard Cole walking toward her, his usual folder in hand. Welcome back, he said with a smile. Julia smiled back. Feels strange. Being on this side of the table. Evelyn said you'd say that. He chuckled. She's in her office. Wants to see you before the session starts. Julia nodded. Of course. Evelyn Harris's office door was open. The light from the tall windows painted golden stripes across the carpet. She sat behind her desk, writing in her ever-present notebook. When she looked up, her face softened. You're early. That's a good sign. Julia laughed. I was too nervous to be late. Evelyn closed the notebook and stood. Nervous means you care. That's where integrity begins. Julia smiled. You always know how to turn fear into wisdom. Evelyn picked up her cane, moving toward her. Not fear, my dear. Perspective. She paused, studying Julia's posture, her eyes. You've changed. I can see it. Julia nodded quietly. Because of you. Evelyn shook her head. Because of you. I just gave you turbulence. You chose how to land. They shared a small laugh. Then Evelyn gestured toward the training room. They're ready. Let's go teach them what it really means to serve." The room quieted when Evelyn entered. Even among executives, her presence commanded respect. Julia followed, heart thudding, palms damp. Evelyn addressed the class first. "Good morning, everyone. Before you learn about emergency procedures and first-class etiquette, I want you to hear a story. It's about one of our own, a woman who made a mistake but found the courage to grow beyond it." Every head turned. Julia felt her pulse in her ears. Evelyn nodded to her. "This is Ms. Julia Monroe," she said. "She'll lead your training today." Julia stepped forward. For a moment, she couldn't speak. The room was too quiet, too watchful. But then she remembered Evelyn's words. "Tell the truth. It doesn't need makeup." "My name is Julia," she began softly. "A few months ago, I became the face of something ugly. Some of you might have seen the video." A murmur went through the room. Some nodded. Some avoided her eyes. "I was the flight attendant who slapped a passenger's hand at JFK," she said plainly. "I thought I was doing my job. I thought I was protecting the rules. But really, I was protecting my ego." The silence deepened. She took a slow breath. "That passenger was our CEO, Ms. Evelyn Harris. I didn't know who she was, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that I didn't see her humanity before her status. And that's what service is supposed to be, about humanity." She paused, letting the words breathe. "I lost everything that day," she continued. "My pride, my confidence, my uniform. And I earned something far more valuable, the chance to start over." Evelyn watched quietly, eyes glistening. Julia went on. "Ms. Harris could have fired me. She could have ruined me. Instead, she taught me that real leadership doesn't destroy. It rebuilds. She sent me to learn from people I'd never looked at twice. Janitors, mechanics, children, refugees. They taught me what flight attendants forget sometimes, that everyone is fighting to belong somewhere." A hand rose in the back. A young trainee, wide-eyed, nervous. "How do you come back from something like that?" Julia smiled gently. "You stop running from it. You let the lesson sit with you until it hurts less and teaches more." Another voice spoke up. "Weren't you scared? That people would always see you as the woman from the video?" Julia nodded. "Yes, but I realized something: you can't control what people remember. You can only control what you do next." And I decided to let my next chapter speak louder than my worst moment. The room was silent again. But this time it wasn't judgment. It was understanding. Julia continued. "Service isn't just about perfect smiles and offering champagne. It's about recognizing the story in every seat, the pain behind every complaint. You never know what battle someone fought to afford that ticket, or what they're escaping from when they board." She took a step closer to the group. "When you serve, don't look down, look across. That's where dignity lives." Evelyn stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "That's the culture we're building here. We don't train attendants. We train ambassadors of empathy." Applause broke out, soft at first, then louder. Julia blinked, overwhelmed. After class, the trainees surrounded her, asking questions, thanking her. One young woman whispered, "Your story made me want to be better." Julia smiled. "That's all any of us can do, try to be better." When the room finally emptied, Julia sat down, exhausted but peaceful. Evelyn joined her, lowering herself carefully into the chair beside her. "You did well," Evelyn said quietly. Julia exhaled. "I didn't think I could face them." "You faced yourself," Evelyn replied. "The rest follows." Julia looked at her. "Do you think people can really change?" Evelyn smiled faintly. People don't change overnight. They evolve in inches, not miles. But yes, they can. Julia nodded, her eyes soft. You've given me more than a second chance, Ms. Harris. You gave me purpose. Evelyn's hand rested lightly on hers. Then promise me something. Pass it on. When someone else stumbles, don't let them fall alone. I promise. They sat there in silence for a while, watching sunlight fall across the polished floor. Outside the window, a plane took off its shadow, crossing the tarmac like a memory leaving for good. Julia smiled, still flying. Evelyn looked at her, eyes bright, still leading. The two women laughed quietly, the sound of redemption echoing softly through the hall. The morning sun shimmered through the airport glass, painting streaks of gold across the polished floor of Terminal B. Julia Monroe walked toward Gate 12 wearing her Global Air uniform again for the first time in nearly a year. The navy fabric felt heavier than before, not because of the weight, but because of what it represented. Redemption, responsibility, renewal. She stopped for a moment at the window, watching a Global Air jet glisten on the tarmac. The hum of engines, the chatter of travelers, the smell of coffee. It all felt familiar, but it didn't own her anymore. Morning, Julia. She turned. Richard Cole stood beside her, his smile calm and reassuring. Big day. Julia nodded. Yeah, first flight back. I'm trying not to let my hands shake. He grinned. Don't worry. They only do that on takeoff. She laughed softly. Evelyn's not coming today. Is she? Richard shook his head. Not in person, but trust me, she's watching. She said this is your final exam. Julia took a deep breath. Then I better pass. The flight to New York was a special one, an investor charter with high-profile passengers, executives, journalists, and a few board members. Every attendant knew eyes would be on them. As Julia boarded, whispers floated through the crew. Some recognized her immediately. The viral clip might have faded, but memory had a way of lingering. Still, her posture was calm, her smile genuine. The first-class cabin gleamed. Passengers settled in with the practiced air of people used to being served. Among them was Cynthia Rhodes, a wealthy businesswoman known for her sharp tongue and lack of patience. She adjusted her pearl necklace and eyed the crew with thinly veiled judgment. When Julia approached to offer pre-flight drinks, Cynthia frowned. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice clipped. "Can you make sure my bag doesn't touch anyone else's? It's expensive." Julia smiled politely. "Of course, ma'am. I'll take care of it personally." Cynthia glanced at her name tag. Monroe. That name sounds familiar. Haven't I seen you somewhere? Julia hesitated. Possibly, ma'am. I've been with Global Air for several years. Cynthia narrowed her eyes. Right. The Internet. You're that flight attendant, aren't you? The cabin went still. Julia felt every eye turn toward her. For a second, the old panic tried to rise the heat in her cheeks, the tightness in her throat. But then Evelyn's voice echoed in her memory. Tell the truth. It doesn't need makeup. Yes, Julia said quietly. That was me. Cynthia smirked. And they hired you back. Julia nodded. They did. Because my mistake became my education. Something in her calm tone unsettled the woman. Cynthia looked away first. Well, just don't make any mistakes on this flight. I'll do my best to make it a good experience for you. Ma'am? Julia moved on, her smile steady, her heart pounding but proud. Mid-flight, turbulence hit. The seatbelt sign blinked on. A sudden jolt made passengers gasp. Coffee spilled. Cynthia yelped as her drink sloshed onto her designer skirt. Oh my God! Are you kidding me? She shouted. This is ridiculous. Julia hurried over, kneeling beside her seat. I'm so sorry, ma'am. Let me help you with that. Cynthia's anger flared. Do you people ever learn? What kind of service is this? Julia handed her a clean napkin. Voice calm. Ma'am, it was turbulence. Completely unpredictable. But I'll replace your drink and get a towel. Cynthia glared. I don't need apologies. I need competence. Julia met her eyes, not defiant. Just human. Understood. And I promise you'll have both. She returned with fresh coffee, setting it down gently. I added a new stirrer, in case the old one touched the spill. Cynthia blinked, caught off guard by the thoughtfulness. A man across the aisle muttered, She's handling it better than I would. The tension eased. Cynthia muttered a quiet, Thank you. Julia smiled. You're welcome. As she walked back to the galley, the captain's voice came over the speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We're climbing above the turbulence now. Julia exhaled slowly, resting her hand against the counter. Her pulse was steady again. Moments later, her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text on the internal crew chat from Evelyn Harris saw the live stream feed. You handled that perfectly. Proud of you. E.H.? Julia smiled to herself. You really are watching, she whispered. An hour later, the flight smoothed out. Passengers laughed, ate, and relaxed. Julia checked on each one, moving with quiet confidence. When she reached Cynthia again, the woman surprised her. You didn't lose your cool, Cynthia said. Most people would have snapped. Julia smiled. I've had a good teacher. Cynthia tilted her head. Your CEO. Yes, ma'am. She taught me that grace isn't about never falling. It's about how you get up. Cynthia studied her for a moment, then nodded. That's a lesson I could probably use. The two women shared a small, genuine smile. When the plane began its descent into New York, Julia felt a strange calm wash over her. She had just faced the same kind of humiliation that once broke her, and this time, she had turned it into understanding. As passengers deboarded, Cynthia stopped by the exit. Ms. Monroe, she said softly. Thank you. For the coffee. And the lesson. Julia smiled warmly. Safe travels, ma'am. After everyone left, the cabin was quiet again. Richard approached from the cockpit, grinning. I think you just passed that final exam with flying colors. Julia laughed. Let's hope Ms. Harris agrees. Richard handed her a folded note. She sent this ahead of landing. Julia opened it. In Evelyn's elegant handwriting, it read, Congratulations. You've learned the highest form of flight grace under pressure. Tears welled in Julia's eyes. That evening, as she walked through the terminal, she caught her reflection in a window uniform, neat, posture straight, eyes bright. Not the same woman from that viral clip. Not anymore. At a nearby gate, a young attendant struggled with an angry passenger. Julia paused, watching. The girl looked on the verge of tears. Without thinking, Julia walked over. Excuse me, she said gently to the passenger. I'm part of the crew here. Let me help. Within minutes, the situation calmed. The passenger left satisfied, and the young attendant exhaled, shaking her head. Thank you. I thought I was about to lose it. Julia smiled. Don't worry. I once lost it too. Just remember, listen before you react. That's how you fly without leaving the ground. The girl blinked. Are you? Julia Monroe. Julia nodded. Guilty. The girl grinned. You're kind of a legend around here. Julia laughed. Let's hope for the right reasons this time. As she walked away, She looked out at the sunset through the giant windows. Planes lined up against the orange sky, waiting for clearance to take off. The horizon stretched wide and forgiving. Somewhere in her mind, she heard Evelyn's voice again. "We rise by lifting others," Julia whispered to herself. "And we keep rising." A soft smile lingered on her face as another plane soared upward, its wings catching the last light of day. She wasn't just flying anymore. She was free. The ballroom shimmered under 100 golden lights, crystal chandeliers, white linen tables, polished silverware. The annual Aviation Leadership Awards had always been a place for prestige and press. But tonight, something else filled the air: expectation. At the far end of the hall, banners read, "Global Air, leading with heart." Reporters whispered, cameras adjusted, and executives mingled over champagne. But all eyes, eventually, would turn toward one woman. Julia Monroe stood backstage, clutching a small folded speech in her hand. Her palms were sweating. Her heart thudded with a rhythm she could feel in her throat. She could hear the muffled voice of the MC announcing the next segment. And now, an unprecedented moment in aviation history, a story of grace, growth, and leadership that changed how an entire industry defines service. Julia swallowed hard. Richard Cole appeared beside her, clipboard in hand, smiling reassuringly. "You ready?" he asked softly. Julia let out a nervous laugh. "Not even close." "Good," he said. "Means you're alive." Before she could respond, the crowd erupted in applause. The MC continued, "Please welcome to the stage the CEO of Global Air, Miss Evelyn Harris." The curtain lifted slightly, and Julia caught a glimpse of her mentor walking onto the stage. Evelyn Harris, elegant in a navy gown, moved slowly but purposefully, her cane tapping lightly on the wooden floor. The audience rose in a standing ovation. Evelyn smiled, humble yet commanding. She reached the podium, waited for the applause to fade, and then spoke in that calm, melodic tone that could quiet any room. "Thank you," she began. "Tonight, we celebrate leadership, not the kind written in reports or measured in revenue, but the kind that begins in silence, in reflection, and sometimes in regret." The crowd leaned in. "Leadership," she continued, "isn't about never falling. It's about learning to rise without stepping on others. And tonight, I want to honor someone who taught me that lesson all over again." The audience murmured. Evelyn smiled faintly. "Please welcome Global Air's own Julia Monroe." The applause returned, louder this time, mixed with curiosity and emotion. Julia stepped out from behind the curtain, her legs trembling slightly. The flash of cameras blinded her for a moment. She took a slow breath and walked toward Evelyn, who extended a steadying hand. Their fingers brushed a quiet, powerful gesture, a teacher and her student, a woman and her mirror. When they reached center stage, Evelyn turned toward the crowd. "A year ago, this young woman made a mistake that millions of people saw. But what they didn't see," she said, "was how she turned that mistake into a mission." She looked at Julia. "Would you share your story?" Julia nodded, stepping up to the microphone. "Good evening," she began softly. "My name is Julia Monroe, and yes, I'm that flight attendant from the video." A ripple of whispers moved through the room. Julia paused, letting the moment settle. "I used to think my job was about rules," she continued, making sure passengers followed them, making sure I was respected. "But that day at JFK, I realized something rules without empathy are just walls we hide behind." She glanced at Evelyn, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. I struck out of pride. I spoke out of fear. And I learned through this incredible woman beside me that leadership isn't power, it's patience. Julia's voice steadied as she went on. Ms. Harris could have fired me. She could have ended my career in a heartbeat. Instead, she handed me a mirror. She showed me who I was and who I could still become. The audience was silent now. No movement, no coughs, just the soft hum of truth settling in the air. I spent months traveling, Julia said. I worked beside janitors, talked to refugees, and served people who had nothing to give back. And I realized service isn't about hierarchy, it's about humanity. She smiled faintly. Every seat on a plane tells a story. Every hand you serve holds a life you'll never fully know. And when you remember that, the sky becomes more than a job. It becomes a classroom. Applause began softly, then grew. Julia took a slow breath, her voice lowering with emotion. I want to thank Ms. Harris for teaching me that redemption doesn't erase the past. It redefines it. She turned slightly toward Evelyn. And thank you for seeing in me what I couldn't see in myself. The applause grew louder, echoing across the hall. Cameras flashed like lightning. Evelyn smiled and stepped forward again, placing a hand gently on Julia's shoulder. You've earned this moment, she said softly. Evelyn turned back to the crowd. In an age where mistakes go viral faster than forgiveness, let tonight be a reminder that compassion is the highest form of professionalism. The crowd erupted again, many standing, some wiping tears. After the ceremony, reporters swarmed. Microphones, flashes, questions. But this time, Julia didn't feel fear. She felt peace. A journalist asked, Ms. Monroe, do you think people can really change? Julia smiled. If they're willing to listen, yes. Change begins the moment we stop defending our pride and start defending our purpose. Another asked Evelyn, why did you forgive her? Evelyn's answer was simple. Because someone once forgave me. Hours later, after the crowd dispersed and the lights dimmed, Julia found herself alone on the empty stage. The ballroom was quiet now, the air filled with the faint scent of roses and champagne. She looked out over the empty chairs, remembering the faces, the applause, the weight of the journey behind her. Evelyn appeared beside her, leaning slightly on her cane. Beautiful speech, she said. Julia smiled. Yours too. Evelyn chuckled softly. You made me proud tonight, more than you'll ever know. Julia looked at her. Do you ever stop teaching? Ms. Harris only when people stop learning, Evelyn said, eyes twinkling. And something tells me you're not done yet. Julia laughed quietly, not even close. They stood side by side, watching stagehands pack up equipment. Outside, through the tall windows, they could see the faint lights of airplanes ascending into the night sky. Evelyn said softly, You know, every time I see a plane take off, I think about how much trust it takes. Every pilot, every attendant, every passenger, all putting faith in something they can't see. Julia nodded. Maybe that's what forgiveness is, too. Evelyn smiled. Exactly. They shared a long, peaceful silence. As they turned to leave, Evelyn stopped. Julia, yes, ma'am. Next year, Evelyn said with a faint grin, I think you should be the keynote speaker. Julia laughed. Only if you sit in the front row. Evelyn smiled. Always. They walked toward the exit together. Two women bound by the same sky, the same scars, the same story that began with a slap and ended with understanding. and as the doors closed behind them, the night sky shimmered with the steady pulse of distant planes. For Julia, it no longer sounded like engines. It sounded like grace. Spring came quietly that year. Dallas was warmer than usual, the air heavy with the scent of magnolia trees. Julia Monroe arrived at Evelyn Harris's home on a Saturday morning, carrying a basket of lemon muffins and a bottle of sweet tea. Evelyn's house sat on a hill overlooking the skyline, modern but modest, filled with old photographs and models of planes that marked the company's history. Julia had been there many times before, but lately her visits had become more frequent. When Evelyn opened the door, Julia noticed how much slower she moved. The cane was no longer just a symbol. It was necessity now. "Morning, Ms. Harris," Julia said, smiling warmly. "I brought breakfast." Evelyn chuckled softly. "You're spoiling me." "Just returning the favor," Julia replied. Stepping inside, the house smelled of vanilla and cedar. A record played softly in the background, Ella Fitzgerald's voice floating through the air like silk. They settled in the living room, sunlight pooling through the curtains. Evelyn sat with her cup of tea, gazing at the skyline. "You know," she said quietly, "Dallas looks smaller every year." Julia smiled. "Or maybe you just learned to see further." Evelyn looked at her, eyes twinkling. "That's something I might have said." Julia laughed. "Guess I've been paying attention." For a while, they talked about small things: the weather, the latest flight reports, the new trainees Julia was mentoring. But beneath the laughter, Julia sensed something heavier. Evelyn's voice was softer, her movements slower. "Are you all right?" Julia finally asked. Evelyn smiled faintly. "Just tired? Doctor says I need to slow down." Julia's expression darkened. "Is it serious?" Evelyn hesitated. "Let's just say my body's ready to retire, before my spirit is." Silence filled the room. The record crackled softly in the background. Evelyn leaned back, her gaze distant. "You know, Julia, every company has a last flight plan, a moment where leadership has to hand over the controls. I think that time's coming for me." Julia felt her chest tighten. "You're not thinking of stepping down?" Evelyn smiled gently. "I'm not thinking about it. I've decided." Julia shook her head. "Global Air needs you. We need you." Evelyn reached over and placed a hand on hers. "No, my dear. What Global Air needs is someone who remembers what it feels like to fall and still chooses to rise." Julia's throat ached. "You mean me?" "I mean exactly you," Evelyn said. "The world doesn't need more perfect leaders. It needs honest ones." Julia blinked back tears. "I can't fill your shoes." Evelyn smiled. "You're not supposed to. You're supposed to walk your own path. Just don't forget where the runway starts." The sunlight shifted across Evelyn's face, revealing the delicate lines that carried decades of storms and triumphs. "You built this company from nothing," Julia whispered. "You fought every wall, every doubt. You can't just stop." Evelyn chuckled softly. "You think stopping means giving up? No, Julia. It means trusting that I've built someone who will keep it flying." Julia sat back, overwhelmed. "Why me?" Evelyn looked at her kindly. "Because you understand what it means to serve from the heart. You've been broken. You've rebuilt. That's what leadership is: not control, but compassion." Tears gathered in Julia's eyes. "You changed my life." Evelyn's voice softened. "You changed mine, too." The two women sat in silence for a long time, the sound of planes faint in the distance. Finally, Evelyn spoke again. "There's something I want to show you," she said. "Come." They walked slowly down the hall to Evelyn's study, the walls lined with photographs, awards, and framed letters. At the center of the room was a glass case containing a small, framed document. Julia stepped closer. It was the original incorporation paper of Global Air. But beneath it was something new, a second frame, smaller, with a single typed page. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "Letter of Intent. Successor Leadership. Julia Monroe." Julia froze. "What is this?" Evelyn smiled. "The board hasn't seen it yet, but when the time comes, they will." Julia shook her head, tears streaming down. "No, you can't. I can," Evelyn said gently. "And I have." Julia covered her mouth. "Miss Harris, I don't know what to say." Evelyn's eyes glistened. "Say you'll keep the heart of this company beating. Say you'll protect it from becoming just another business that forgets people." Julia nodded slowly, her voice trembling. "I promise." Evelyn exhaled softly, relief and peace washing over her face. "Good. Then my work here is done." Later that evening, they sat outside on the patio, watching the sun set over the city. The sky was streaked with orange and lavender, the same colors Julia remembered from her first flight years ago. Evelyn held her tea with both hands, the steam curling up toward the fading light. "You know, when I first met you, I saw my younger self in your eyes," she said. "Ambitious, impatient, proud." Julia smiled faintly. "That's not exactly a compliment." Evelyn laughed softly. "Oh, it is. Pride built my wings. Humility taught me how to use them." Julia leaned back, gazing at the horizon. "What happens now?" Evelyn's eyes followed hers. "Now you lead. You teach. You tell the story, not just mine, but ours. Because stories keep companies human. They remind people why they started dreaming in the first place." Julia's voice cracked. "I don't want to lose you." Evelyn smiled. "You won't. You'll see me every time a flight attendant kneels to comfort a crying child. Every time someone says thank you to the janitor. Every time you choose grace over pride. That's where I'll be." The wind stirred gently, carrying the distant hum of planes overhead. Julia closed her eyes, memorizing the sound, the warmth, the weight of this moment. When she opened them again, Evelyn was looking at her with that same steady gaze, strong, patient, proud, still flying. Evelyn whispered. Julia nodded through tears. "Still flying." As the first stars appeared, Evelyn's voice softened, almost to a whisper. "Promise me one last thing." "Anything," Julia said. "When it's your turn to hand over the controls," Evelyn murmured, "make sure it's to someone who's fallen and learned to rise." Julia smiled through her tears. "I promise." They sat together as the night settled in, the city lights flickering below like a field of fireflies. Somewhere above, a Global Air jet cut through the darkness, its lights blinking like a heartbeat in the sky. And for the first time, Julia didn't just see a plane. She saw a legacy, one built not from power, but from forgiveness, faith, and the courage to start again. The morning sky over Dallas was painted in soft shades of gold and blue. The airfield shimmered with the heat of early summer. On the runway stood a Global Air aircraft, gleaming, elegant, ready for its final symbolic flight. Inside the terminal, Julia Monroe adjusted her blazer and took a deep breath. Today wasn't a regular flight. It was a farewell, a private journey honoring Evelyn Harris, who would be taking her last trip aboard the airline she built. News outlets called it the Founder's Flight, but for Julia, It was something else entirely. It was goodbye. She walked down the jet bridge slowly, her heels echoing against the metal floor. The scent of the cabin hit her leather, coffee, and faint traces of jet fuel. She smiled. This was home. At the front of the plane stood Richard Cole, clipboard in hand. He looked up and smiled. "You ready?" Julia nodded. "As I'll ever be." "She's boarding now," he said softly. Evelyn appeared at the doorway, moving slowly but proudly, her cane tapping against the floor. Her hair was silver, her eyes bright as ever. The crew lined up on both sides, applauding quietly. Julia stepped forward, voice gentle. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Harris." Evelyn smiled. "It feels strange being greeted on my own plane." "Then let's call it home," Julia said. "Home works," Evelyn replied. They shared a small laugh before taking their seats in the front cabin. The engines hummed softly, a familiar rhythm that had followed both of them through decades of sky. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Julia looked over at Evelyn, who gazed out the window. "You okay?" Evelyn nodded. "I'm exactly where I should be." Julia smiled. "First class all the way." Evelyn turned to her, eyes glinting with humor. "Only because I built it." They both laughed, a quiet, tender sound that filled the space between them. When the plane lifted off, Evelyn's hand gripped the armrest gently. She looked out as the city shrank beneath them, the horizon stretching endless and bright. "Every time I see that," she said softly, "I remember my first flight as a little girl. We were the only black family on board. My mother dressed us in our Sunday best just to be treated like we didn't belong." Julia listened, her heart heavy and full at once. Evelyn continued, "I promised myself that if I ever built an airline, everyone would belong. No one would ever have to prove they deserved to fly." Julia swallowed hard. "And you did it. You really did." Evelyn smiled faintly. "We did. You helped remind me why I started." The seatbelt sign turned off. The attendants began serving tea, moving quietly and gracefully. Passengers spoke in soft tones, aware they were part of something historic. Julia reached into her bag and pulled out a small black notebook, Evelyn's old journal, the one she had written in for decades. "I think you forgot this," she said, placing it on Evelyn's lap. Evelyn ran her hand over the worn cover. "No, I didn't forget. I left it for you." Julia blinked. For me, Evelyn nodded. "Every page in there holds lessons I wrote for myself. Now they're yours. Fill the rest with your own." Julia's eyes burned with tears. "I don't deserve this." Evelyn smiled gently. "You earned it the day you stopped defending your mistake and started living your purpose." The rest of the flight was peaceful. They talked about little things, favorite meals, old memories, the future of global air. But beneath it all, Julia could feel time slipping, like sand through her fingers. When the plane touched down in Savannah, Georgia Evelyn's hometown, the cabin burst into applause. She looked out the window at the familiar landscape, eyes glistening. "Welcome home," Julia whispered. "Feels like it," Evelyn said softly. They disembarked slowly. Cameras flashed from a distance, but Julia guided Evelyn gently through the crowd, shielding her from the chaos. At the end of the tarmac, a group of Global Air staff stood holding a banner that read, "Thank you, Ms. Harris." Evelyn smiled, tears forming. "You see that's what legacy looks like." Julia squeezed her hand. "That's what love looks like." The ceremony was small, private, heartfelt. Evelyn gave a short speech, her final one. She stood before the gathered employees, her voice trembling but steady. Global Air was never about airplanes, she said. It was about people, the ones who dreamed, the ones who worked, and the ones who believed. If you remember that, this company will never fall from the sky. She paused, looking at Julia. And if you ever forget, this woman will remind you. Applause broke out. Julia stood frozen, her heart full and breaking all at once. That night, they returned to Dallas on a quiet evening flight. Evelyn rested her head against the window, watching the clouds drift by. "Julia," she said softly, "yes, promise me you'll keep telling stories like ours, the kind that make people feel less alone." Julia smiled through tears. "I promise." Evelyn closed her eyes, a faint smile on her lips. "Good. Then I can rest easy." A few weeks later, Evelyn passed away peacefully in her sleep. The world mourned the loss of a visionary, the woman who changed aviation. News outlets replayed her speeches, quoted her wisdom, and showed the viral video that started everything, now framed in a new light. At the memorial, Julia stood before thousands of employees and friends. She wore a simple navy dress, Evelyn's favorite color, and held the black journal in her hand. She began softly, her voice calm but full of emotion. "Evelyn Harris taught me that forgiveness isn't weakness. It's strength in its purest form. She showed me that leadership isn't about how high you climb, but how many people you lift along the way." Her eyes glistened. She believed in me when the world didn't. And now, it's my turn to believe in others. She closed the journal gently. "Ms. Harris once said we rise by lifting others. I think it's time we all keep rising." The audience stood, the sound of applause echoing like thunder. Months passed. Julia officially became the acting CEO of Global Air. Her first day in the new office felt surreal. Evelyn's cane still leaned in the corner, her photograph smiling from the wall. Julia sat behind the desk, opened the journal, and began to write. Day 1. The sky feels different today, not because it's mine, but because I understand it now. Evelyn taught me that grace can outlive mistakes, and maybe that's what flying really means, not escaping the world, but rising above it. She looked out the window as a Global Air jet lifted into the sky, sunlight catching its wings. For a moment, she could almost hear Evelyn's voice calm, confident, eternal. "Keep flying, Julia." She smiled. Always. As the plane disappeared into the clouds, Julia stood, straightened her jacket, and whispered to the empty room, "For you, Ms. Harris, always for you." The wind outside shifted, rattling the windows gently, like a quiet applause from the heavens, and somewhere above the endless sky. Evelyn Harris was smiling, watching her student, her successor, her friend still flying, at its heart. Flight Attendant Slaps Black CEO, not knowing she's the airline owner, isn't a story about scandal. It's about humanity. It reminds us that one mistake doesn't define who we are. How we respond to it does. Julia's fall from grace teaches us that humility can't be learned from praise, only from pain. And Evelyn Harris, the CEO, shows that true leadership is not about authority. It's about empathy. In a world that rushes to judge, this story whispers, slow down. Everyone carries battles we don't see. The rude passenger, the angry coworker, the quiet stranger sitting next to us on a plane. Each has a story, a wound, a reason. For older generations who have seen life's ups and downs, this story is a gentle reminder that forgiveness of others and of ourselves is the only real freedom. Time changes faces, but compassion keeps hearts young. And sometimes, the people we least expect become our greatest teachers. So tonight, before you close your eyes, ask yourself, who have I not forgiven? And what would my life feel like if I finally did? Because grace, once given, never disappears. It just finds new wings. Thank you, dear viewers, for watching, feeling, and flying with this story. If it touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. So together, we can keep telling stories that remind us we're all human and we're all still flying.